let me tell you what the framework will be this session. My name is Heather Booth. I was introduced before, and we'll do little introductions in just a minute. Some of us have waited 50 years to have this discussion, and some of the next generation can also inform what we've been thinking by your own experiences. In a few minutes, we'll go around and ask each of you to say, if you were in the anti-war movement, where you were, what you were part of, and if you're in an organization or active now, where you are and what you're part of now, just very briefly as we go around, or if there's any fast thing to share. And then, actually, before we do that, I'm going to give a short overview of a perspective that I've got on the women's movement and the anti-war movement and their relationship to each other. But as we've said in the other introductions, it wasn't just one organization. It was a messy, beautiful movement. As a result, there are many versions. So I'm going to share things that were, I thought, significant, but we also want to hear from you. There may be other truths too. So I'll give 5 minutes or so of just an overview, and then ask each of you to say, if you were in the movement, where you were, and what you were part of, and if you are in the movement now, for whatever, where you are and what you're part of, or anything you'd like to share. We'll just go very quickly around. We have an hour. Any questions before we start? And for a little overview. The anti-war movement was many, many things, often contradictory, and all of it was challenging the general society and also reflected the society. Come sit down. This is on the women's movement.
Do you mind?
We'd love you to be here. But that itself was part of the different strands of the movement, which we'll but we just started. How women were within the anti-war movement is itself open to different interpretations. The anti-war movement, in my view, was both liberating, giving women our own voice, and limiting in the role of women. On the one hand, there were strong women's voices, and we saw some of them here last night. Cora Weiss, Judy Lerner, Vivian Rothstein, Marge to Bangin. Bernadine Dohrn will be here later. Judy Lerner, right on cue. and pull up another chair, yes. A great heroine. Who was here last night? You heard Judy's comments. Really just so inspiring. Again, recognition for Judy Lerner. Second generation. Yes. A couple of chairs over there. In the war, there also were nurses, and in the anti-war movement, women were really at the core of the people who often did the work. Even on this committee, everyone did special things. Everyone did special roles. And it was important, not only for symbolic reasons, that we had men and women working together. Women are often the core of what we work on. There were many who also felt we had special ability to speak to the American public as mothers and as wives. Many on our own were passionate advocates about the war. On the other hand, the leadership and much of the focus during the anti-war movement were on men. The pictures and top leadership were often those of men, in part because they were the ones being drafted, and it was much of the focus of what was going on about the war, but also in the society as a whole at that time. So there were reasons for both parts, for the limiting and for the liberation. For the liberation, women's groups working against the war included Women's Strike for Peace, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Jeanette Rankin Brigade, named for the one congressperson who voted against U.S. entry into World War I, just to name some. There were also women donors who supported the movement and other prominent individuals, and many whose names we will never know. And here is one of the great leaders. I already called out your name before, Cora.
I can't handle it.
And I asked Cora,
If it weren't for everybody in this room, nothing would have happened.
well, and there were some who particularly inspired us. And Cora Weiss. Many people heard you also last night, and Judy Lerner is also here. And again, recognition for Cora Weiss.
And Karen and everybody else's name I've forgotten.
In a moment, and Cora, I mentioned that what we'll do is in a moment we'll go around and actually ask each person to speak about what they did then, where they were then, what they're doing now, and then we'll see if there's time for a general discussion. For my own background, I held what was, might have been the first women's meeting at the student anti-war movement in the We Won't Go conference. It was an anti-draft conference. And someone coined the phrase, "Women say yes to men who say no." I did not coin the phrase. I also was arrested with 2 other women in an early draft protest demonstration when Clark Kissinger, people may remember that name, showed up to aggressively want his induction because he wanted to fight against the war from the inside. He actually was not accepted into induction. On the other hand, while the women's experience in the anti-war movement was both liberating, for many it was also limiting. Remember, there was the women's movement, while simmering since at least 1965, wasn't present as a major social force until 1970. And that was when there was August 26th, the women's strike, and the theme of that was "Don't iron while the strike is hot." And there were many struggles that underscored women's roles, but weren't really in the public consciousness until after there really was a more vital women's movement. And even today, we still struggle. There was a great focus on the draft, and so the men were called up based on an arbitrary number and then drafted into the war unless they found a reason for exclusion. Just as one example of the limiting nature and background of the movement, when I was speaking at a University of Chicago SDS meeting, where I was a local leader, one of the guys, while I was talking, said, shut up. I was so shocked that I finished what I said, went around and tapped the shoulder of all the women in the meeting, which was about half the group, and said, "Let's go upstairs." We left and founded what I believe was the first campus group of the Women's Liberation Movement. And Marilyn Webb, who wasn't able to be here, but we were going to do the workshop at one time together, she remembers being one of the first and only speakers at a national anti-war rally. And with a mostly male audience, she recalls people yelling out such things as, "Take her off the stage and fuck her." There's a movie now called She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and that's reenacted a little bit. There are others who never heard of experiences like that.
Get this man a chair, please.
There's chairs back here.
Thanks.
We love them. So we were a set of contradictions. Vivian Rothstein used to say that, like the Israelites fleeing Egypt who spent 40 years in the desert, and none of them were able to make it to the promised land because we were too much products of the old society. So too it was with many in the movement. That we could describe a way that we wanted to go, but might not make it ourselves. It's not surprising that the Chicago 8 were all men, both because so much of the leadership was men, and also the police also reflected that bias and looked for the men and not the women. So we in the movement were filled with contradictions. There were tensions over our roles. Tensions often played out in the movement. Even within the women in the anti-war movement, there were differences. Should we have a united struggle with men, or should there be separate organizations? It's reflected in the discussion even about this workshop. There were some on our committee who felt we shouldn't have a separate women's workshop because that will mean the women get segregated. We said then all the good speakers will be in this workshop, they won't be in the other ones. And so in a way we felt, gee, that recognition said people have learned something in the last 50 years. There were some women who also thought that the style we should adopt was a style of men that was often a tough, you know, F-you kind of standard of approach. And there were others who thought the anti-war movement was primary and didn't really appreciate the women's movement. On the other hand, there were those who thought the women's movement was primary and thought that those who were in mixed organizations with men and women weren't adequately women-identified women. All these issues and contradictions came into play as we built a movement, helped to end the war and change the world. For all the various strands and backgrounds, the anti-war movement did help to create a women's movement, and the women's movement did help to humanize and transform an anti-war movement, not just then, but for now. And women in our emerging movement helped to create part of the developments that really are of a new generation that are much more understanding of gender, race, diversity in general in the society. So now I'd really like to open it up. Oh, we're so glad all of you have come. We weren't sure if this would be a very small group, just 10 or so of us around the table. And actually here, they can come around, so well, it'll be a circle. So what I thought we would do for opening this up was to literally go around and give a chance for everyone to say something if you want. If you want to pass, that's okay too. But to say, if you were in the movement, in the anti-war movement, where you were then, what your main activity was. If you're active now, where you are now, what your main activity is now, and perhaps sharing one thought. We're going to ask, let me just see how many people want to. This is where we thought it was a much smaller group. It may be that it's too large for doing this. So maybe why don't we start and see if there are a few people who would like to share with that. But really, we'll open it up for discussion, but that may be one way to start off the discussion. And I did ask Cora Weiss to come, and perhaps we take a few comments in general, and then ask Cora particularly to comment on her experience, because Cora and Judy helped to found some of the key anti-war organizations and anti-war women's organizations. And those of you who were here last night may remember that Cora's first advice to the next generation, the key piece of advice was, make sure half your delegation is women.
I'd like to see half this room men. We need men, great support, the women's demand.
Yes, so there, why don't we take, let's see, many hands are up. Go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
There's a man who wants to talk all
6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, well, let's see how far we get. Yes.
My name is Patty Huntington, and I came to Washington, D.C. as a young Army wife at 22. It was September 9th, 1969, the day Ho Chi Minh died. And that had a lot of meaning for me, not that day, but in the subsequent months. In January of 1970, Capitol Hill was holding the pill hearings about the efficacy of the birth control pill, and I was on the pill, and I decided to go to the women's liberation meetings, and I declared myself at the end of that day a feminist. It was a huge, not a huge leap really, but what happened thereafter was huge to me. I joined the collective of Off Our Backs, and Anka, wherever you are over there, she was part of that too. And then I joined a women's theater group called Earth Onion, Women's Improvisational Theater, based here in Washington. We did a lot of anti-war skits and traveled around the United States. For 5 years I was doing that, and then after that I formed a bilingual women's anti-imperialist band called Lucha. And I had traveled to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade in 1974 and was honored with being given the opportunity to bring together all of the different communities working against the war in Vietnam and presenting at the plenary the North Americans' activism for that year.
Oh, we so appreciate that. You would want to. Just recognize everyone. Just keep moving down.
Is there some place we can get more chairs in case some other people come in?
Oh, are there?
There's a chair.
There are two chairs left.
No, there's at least one chair. There are two chairs here.
Getting more folding chairs or something?
And there's a chair. Chair over there.
Is it Gosselin?
There's a chair over there.
I really would rather stay.
Oh, okay.
White
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. Just the women.
As the war was ending though, the women of, I guess, New York, organized a group of us from around the country to send delegates to Montreal to meet with Vietnamese women. I was chosen from Washington, D.C. as a cultural worker. So at the spring of 1975, I wrote a song for the women of Vietnam, and if there's time later, I'll sing it.
We're going to move fairly quickly so that so many who do want to speak have waited 50 years.
My name is Randy Ross. Many years ago, my name was Randy Rappaport, so there's a few people in the room who are saying, oh, yes.
We're in college together.
Yes, we went to University of Chicago together. Yes, 50 years to say a lot, but I'm going to just try to be really quick. I was in Berkeley, I was in Boston. I left Berkeley and the anti-war movement and all the work in Berkeley after having been in the South because the women in Boston just drew me there. Bread and Roses, it was like, I just had to be in Boston where Bread and Roses was. But over many years, what is it, 3 or 4 years, I always felt the tension between anti-imperialism and the women's movement, although I knew underneath it was the same, but the tensions were always there. In the summer of 1970, I was invited to go on a trip to North Korea, North Vietnam, and China with a delegation that was led by Eldridge Cleaver and Bob Scheer. Yes, there's a lot to say about that. I'm not going to say that. But jump many years, many years of social justice work and education, and I returned to North Vietnam in 2013 with my family, led by my daughter, who said, Mom, it's time for you to go. We're doing this. And I had the chance to meet with Madam Bin at the time that I was there. So this evening, Judy Gumbo and I are reading from Madam Bin's autobiography. I've been working with Lady Borton, who's her translator, for many months, let's say, to update the version. So we are going to be handing out copies tonight of our excerpts from the book. And I just want to say in this group, which I may say tonight or not, but that Madam Bin's love for the women of the anti-war movement and the women of the women's movement is so profound, and her connection, her deep feelings, she mentions in the book Cora, Weiss, and others who I will be mentioning tonight. I mean, it brings tears to my eyes just to be able to communicate with all of you how much she loves us, how much she believes that we have been and always will be important to the people of Vietnam.
My name is Jean Bishop. I got involved in the anti-war movement when Robert McNamara came to Harvard. I was kind of on the fence, and he climbed. We trapped him in one of those tiny little streets in Cambridge, and he gets on the car and he says, "I was a student in Berkeley, and I was tougher than you were then, and I'm tougher than you are now." And I thought, wow, he's still Secretary of Defense in this and then I went back to dinner in my Radcliffe dorm, and everyone's saying, "Oh, did you hear what those horrible people did?" And I thought, okay, I know which side I'm on. I think in terms of Harvard SDS and the women, it was about like Harvard and women. I mean, there was a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio, and it was reflecting back. It was a horrible place. Didn't have any of the advantages of an all-girls school. Anyway, but like as Heather said, when I graduated in 1968, we all organized Girls Say Yes to Guys Who Say No, and we wore armbands. Because it was in 1968, you really went, if you had the wrong number, you had to be enough. And I stayed in Boston, was one of the people who put out The Old Mole, which was
Great.
just was, but easily, obviously, transitioned into Bread and Roses. And while I think that the anti-war movement was one big transformative movement in my life, the women's movement totally transformed my life. I helped to start a free clinic for women and children in Somerville, and I said, gosh, I could go to that hospital, and did, and that really totally changed everything I did, and so I think that the anti-war movement is being very important and helping us, and helping me and the women's movement think about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. The women's movement was really transformative.
I'm glad we're using this just to hear people's stories.
Yeah.
A lot to say.
My name is Ellen Mitchell, and I want to thank Heather for the summary that you gave, because I think it did capture the contradictions that we all felt, or many of us felt. I was a member of Students for Democratic Society at large in New York, and a member of the underdraft committee. I was one of the women who did say yes to a man who said no, and we've been married for 46 years. And he served 2 years in prison. He was one of the early draft resistors, David Mitchell, and his case went up to the Supreme Court and was denied with a dissent by naming the justices. And I think that caught me in the middle, because very often I was asked to present his position. I did represent him when he was in jail and visited him every month, which was an interesting experience, and spoke at the Pentagon and one of the demonstrations representing him. But I also was very active in the women's movement, and certainly when the Iraq War started, was out there, and have continued both. I've raised 2 daughters who are feminists also.
I'm Kathleen, or Kathy Barnett, depending on when you get it. And I just want to also thank Heather for the introduction, but also make the link, at least for me personally, between the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the feminist movement. And how all of those, I just feel very grateful to have matured during the time when those movements were open and available to me, because I just learned from all of them and began in that trajectory as a very naive, help the world American blah blah Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal and West Africa, and was there during the height of the beginnings and worst times of the resistance to segregation, oppression at home, the beginnings of the civil rights. So I'm questioning, what am I doing in Africa when we have all these issues in home? And had the good luck to come home, and there was an organization of returned volunteers called the Committee of Returned Volunteers. John McAuliffe, in fact, was a leader in that national organization. I was in the New York chapter with my colleague Carly, and we really took early positions against the war, and were really active. It gave me the structure to become involved, and it was just so beneficial to me. And then, in New York, the women kicked the men out of the CRB office and took it over, because the men were making all the decisions, doing all the policy, whatever, and the women were making coffee and Xeroxing or something. And we formed a pretty consciousness-raising group based on where you lived in New York. We were in the same room. Yes. And that was just, from there on, all of those issues, we're still the 2 of us, and most of our women from that time are still engaged, and we're just very fortunate. This is a great meeting, and I've been encouraging John to have a reading of the CLD.
I know there were 9 that first had raised their hands. Were you next?
I think so. I love the stories, and I don't usually speak, so this is an opportunity. I'm Elizabeth Banfield, Beth Sutton, if you knew me at Stanford in 1968. The anti-war movement completely changed my life. My 2 hours in the Santa Clara County Jail, courtesy of the policeman who did find the freshman women who were not wearing shoes that you could run in. was a major change. My brother had been drafted and was serving in Vietnam at the time. He was a doctor in Hanto. He had come through my dormitory in uniform on his way out. It was an interesting experience. My parents, needless to say, were not happy about what I was doing. As far as I know, I'm the only debutante who bowed in Kansas City while out on bail. A point that my daughters and grandchildren think is immensely entertaining. I wanted to go to Vencerenas, and my parents said, if you do, don't come home. And I wasn't willing to do that. So I got to Cuba 40 years later. Not my 20th birthday, but for my 60th birthday, legally. The changes that the anti-war movement made in the way I looked at the world, the way that I sadly had a lot of conflict with my parents at that point, but led me into a really different understanding of who I was as a woman. Obviously from Kansas City, not in Kansas anymore, in so many ways. As a Foreign Service spouse, I've spent most of my life trying to figure out what I represent in many overseas communities. As part of Stanford's Volunteers in Asia program, I taught in Hong Kong, and I'm still in touch with a former student 45 years later. So here I am a teacher and have spent a lifetime trying to interpret what that means. That if you teach the women, you teach the children, and it is a delight to be back remembering what this all began for so many years.
Thank you for speaking.
Yeah.
That women's movement helped us all find our voice.
Yes.
It's one of the ways we've made the whole world richer.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Bill Sweet. I'm one of those guys who said no, but I can't say that translated into a whole lot of sex. I'm sorry to say, I'm sorry that I'm still sorry. I went to college with Heather, although we were never acquainted and still in fact are not. I was a year or two behind her. She was already then a major campus celebrity, so I was always very aware of what she was up to. And you know, I was not in any sense a political activist leader in those days. I was strictly you might say a grassroots follower and activist. But I just wanted to say, I wanted to sort of affirm from my point of view something you said in your remarks, Heather, which is that it was during the sit-ins at the University of Chicago that I did in the late 60s that I first witnessed what we came to call women's lib, what I think of as the, sort of the second great wave of American feminism. And just a couple of weeks ago, I coincidentally found myself saying this to somebody, that the first time I saw, you know, women standing up in meetings and expressing themselves, asserting themselves, and there being this tremendous, palpable, visible tension between those female leaders and the majority male leaders. That was when I saw that, and that was, you know, in retrospect, even at the time, I think, and especially in retrospect, that was tremendously important. Yeah, I think of that second great wave of American feminism as being hatched in the ranks of, you know, in the leadership ranks of the anti-war movement. But anyway, you know, even though, as I say, I was a minor figure, it had a completely transformative effect on my life too, and it's really great being here. Thank you.
So glad to know you now, if not then. By the way, the University of Chicago, we had the first sit-in against the war in Vietnam. Jeff Blum says the story is really because there was we were petitioning, it had to do with the university collaborating with ranking male students and sending that rank to the draft board. And we were petitioning outside the administration building. He says it started to rain. We went inside to the building. We sat down. The rain continued. We had the first sit-in against the war. Word spread, and the national secretary of SDS came over on seeing the publicity about it. We sat next to each other, His name is Paul Booth, and we've been married now. So, was there, oh, yes, Karen?
I wasn't in the number, but.
There were, I know we had like 9 at first, and then we'll expand it out.
I was
So,
8, I don't know.
okay, Charlotte,
You're right.
why don't we do Charlotte, Karen, and there, and then we'll take another, and then maybe at that point, I wondered, Cora, would you like to speak at that point? Cora, Judy, and hand here, and maybe ending with Leslie. I don't know that we'll have much more time.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Bear. I was living in Oregon 64 to 68 and got very involved in the Eugene McCarthy campaign. And I just want to remind you all that he did win Oregon. And all of us are liberal people if we want to talk about grassroots. But I was not a leader. I was out talking, going door to door, talking to bloggers in Springfield, Oregon, out of my comfort zone completely. And what they said last night about never forget the power of dialogue, that's what I take away. You talk one-to-one with people, you find that there's much more agreement than disagreement, and one by one, over the weeks, I think we really got people to see what was going on with the war and why they needed to be against it. So that's influenced my whole life. I have never been a leader, but I have done so much door-to-door campaigning on many issues. And I think my daughter says to me, well, of course I always knew you were a feminist. It comes out in the little ways, and those are the important things. Now I live in Washington, D.C., just in case you wanted to know.
My name is Jim Forat. In 1964, I was a young actor, and I was doing a scene rehearsal with an actress by the name of Marquetta Kimball for a class at Lee Strasberg. And she said to me, well, meet me in Father Duffy's Square, and then we'll go rehearse. It was April of 1964. Father Duffy Square was certainly the first anti-Vietnam demonstration in New York City. And that was one of the early ones. There were 60 of us, 30 of us got arrested. We were all found guilty. I told the truth, and the cop lied on the stand, and that radicalized me. Finally, it was a woman that got me to go to that place. And from that point on, I was radicalized. And through, up to 1969, I was very active in anti-war things. One of the co-founders of the hippie party. We were trying to get hippies to be political against the war. In 1969, by happenstance, I was on Christopher Street when Stonewall happened. And as you know, the new left and the old left shared one thing in common, and that was homophobia as well as sexism. And the second night of that, some of us actually did organize things. They never say, it wasn't a riot, by the way. I've been in riots in Newark. We called every political group that we'd ever been associated with, the 7 of us that were trying to keep this going. No one showed up. You know, we've always been, you know, we queer people have always been in these movements, but not out. And so that changed my political focus. And the Gay Liberation Front was a multi-issue organization, very much in the beginning led by women. We have gender empowerment in our meetings, which the women coming, who have been kicked out in a sense by Betty, who came into GOF, really set the agenda. We had consciousness-raising groups. And I remember saying something very stupid. I said to a lesbian feminist friend of mine, I can't be sexist, I'm a gay man. But it was in the consciousness-raising groups that I learned about sexism. And I learned about how we were part of the male sort of tradition. It wasn't until 1971 that I'm aware of that a gay or lesbian person was able to speak at a major rally. And this was in New Haven for Bobby Seale. And they didn't want to let any of us speak. It was Dwight McDonald and a woman whose name I cannot remember, who argued on the organizing committee that they should let us speak. Again, a woman stood up for the lesbians and gay people to speak. We were put on last, but we were very happy to speak for them. And I've had a lot of political work and cultural work since then, but I will tell you, Madam New, Madam Bin, sorry.
Right.
Anna was on the other team.
No, Madam Bin, I apologize. She was our hero. Our t-shirts were lavender with her picture on them. I still have a few of those. And we were in demonstrations like for Angela Davis when she was in Gerald, you know. We always looked to women leadership, the kind of theory that was coming forward from the radical lesbian aspect, but also from the women's group. And I'm internally grateful. And it's gotten me in a shitload of trouble over the years. Because the feminism that I learned in those early days has stayed with me and really principally organized the way I look at the world. So I'm very grateful to all the women in this room who fought within the anti-war movement because it was sexist and it certainly was homophobic. But it didn't stop us. You know, the thing is that we all showed up in our closets, if that's what it was. You know, we all showed up and did the work because we were able to look beyond a single issue point of view.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really, really appreciate it. And by the way, Amy Kesselman, who was part of women's liberation and the anti-war movement in New Haven, is writing a book about the New Haven women's movement. And I'll give you her connection because I think she would like to hear the story and may be able to identify that woman. I was going to see if Karen and then Cora and Judy might like to speak. And then we'll go to here. Yeah.
I was 10 years old when the anti-war movement started, so I wasn't really a part of that. But I believe I stood on the shoulders of all those women like Cora and Judy. You know, there's that were doing that. And I didn't go to college. And so I went right to work out of high school, and I became a working class feminist because they said, no, you can't do that because you're a woman. And even though, you know, smoking wasn't a good thing, they said, oh, you can't smoke at your desk, you have to go into the ladies' room to smoke your cigarettes. So that really made me angry. I became a truck driver, I drove a truck cross country. And then I started working for the peace movement. And my first action was the Women's Pentagon Action. Ellsberg and many others, we encircled the Pentagon. And currently I am chair of the WAN, Women's Action for New Directions. And you know, we are part of the Women, Peace and Security movement now. 1325 is very important to all of us. And I was a citizen diplomat, following Cora's example, and went to the Soviet Union many times as a citizen diplomat. So I'm just so thrilled to be in this room. These women.
I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
And Cora, and thank you for coming to the workshop.
Where else would I go?
Is there another room?
So I can't wait to read the book, which is going to come out of this room, called What We Did, What Women Did, Stroke, Do. And if any of you has a graduate student who would like to take that on, I really recommend it as a PhD job. And because every story is fantastic, and we have to hear them all. I loved these stories. So I just have two things to say quickly. The past was terrific. We did a lot of things. We took a lot of shit, and it was difficult, and it was rewarding. And you can read about it when this person writes the book. I want to talk about the future. Because if this meeting and this effort and this energy and this money that went into this doesn't come out with what are we going to do next, so it shouldn't be a total loss, as some of us say. So Karen mentioned 1325. Does anybody here know what Security Council Resolution 1325 is all about? Women, peace, and security. It was drafted by women, vetted by women, and it was unanimously adopted by the Security Council. And under the Charter of the UN, all member states agree to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Now, I was one of the drafters. There were only a dozen of us from civil society. And it says that women have to, that never says have to. That's one of its problems, but we overcome the problems. That women are to be at every level of decision-making, every level of governance, in every peace process, and at the peace table. and we are to prevent violent conflict. Governments are to prevent violent conflict. We're trying to implement that in the countries. We've got about 55 countries now that have national action plans. One of the problems is that when Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State in 2010, it was her turn to try to get a national action plan, and the first people she gave it to draft was the Department of Defense. Well, we were all peace people, and it was the intention of the resolution was a peace resolution, and we had no interest in seeing the DOD get their hands on it, but they did, and it's being co-opted in this country, and the military will say, you see, we have women in the military, we're even going to let them get killed. And so it's a problem. But around the world, it's being implemented, and it's putting women at the table. I just want you to know that. Meredith Stricker is here, and she runs the Women, Peace and Security program for a group of progressive funders. It's something that we should carry with us, because it should be implemented at every level of governance, in your village council, in your state government, and so forth. But I want to talk about tomorrow, just for a couple of minutes. There is a project taking place right now, and it's getting a lot of applause, and it's getting a lot of attack. And it's called Women Cross the DMZ.
Great.
Gloria Steinem, Mayreed Corrigan, Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lema Bowie, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and women from about 15 countries, 30 women altogether, on May 24th, which is International Women's Disarmament Day. I never knew about women having a disarmament day. I've been in the disarmament field for about 40 years, but I'm very glad to have it. On May 24th, I'm not going, but I've been working on it 24/7, are going to cross the DMZ from North Korea to South Korea, because 70 years of war is 70 years too many. It's never been stopped. There is no peace agreement. And the people of North and South Korea are looking for reunification. They are one culture, one food, one language, one country, they feel, and they should be together. They've been divided for 70 years. It's the most landmined, most militarized land in the world, and it's also the most gorgeous, because no human foot has set foot on the land of the DMZ except for the two strips going on either side, where one's a railroad track and one is a car track. And so the natural flora and fauna have gone on, and my view is we have to demine it without exploding the mines. Anyway, this is the point. The point is that women have grabbed this idea because of citizen diplomacy, because of women's diplomacy, because the men have never, this administration is the first administration since Eisenhower that hasn't convened a six-party talk. All of the Republican presidents until now have made some kind of an effort to bring people around the table. They haven't reunified the country, but I don't understand. I don't understand more today than I've ever not understood before. So, women are leaving, they're going to Beijing, they're going to fly from Beijing to Pyongyang, they're going to meet with the North Korean, I keep saying Vietnamese sometimes, North Korean Women's Union, and have a symposium in North Korea. And they're going to go to the border where the armistice agreement was signed 70 years ago. It's a small house, Adele was in it, and we're asking both governments, we have permission from both governments to go. It took a long time and a lot of citizen diplomacy. And now it's up to something called the UN Command, which literally has nothing to do with the UN, but with the US, to facilitate the walk, because they manage the DMZ. There are thousands of soldiers on both sides. There's barbed wire. When I spoke in South Korea a few years ago, they gave me a gift of a framed piece of barbed wire from the DMZ. And now there's a new gun that Jody Williams tried to describe to me, which is based on the drone system, which can see 3 miles away and hit its target. That's a hell of a piece of scientific technology.
What progress.
Right. So the women will then walk into this armistice house, and the idea is to have North Korean women and South Korean women sit in that armistice house together with the 30 international women, and that, if it happens, will be truly historic, because for 70 years, only one side or the other can be in the house at one time. So if you are from South Korea or with a tour group, you can sit in the house, but then you have to leave, so in case there's a...
Cora has made history in the past, in the present, and uses this
Well, we have to, we can't
organize
stop.
for the future,
Okay.
absolutely.
So here's
It's
the end of the
wonderful.
story. The end of the story is, write down womencrossdmz.org. On that website, you can find a letter that you can sign on to, which endorses and supports this initiative, A. B, you can send it to your member of Congress, you can send it to your rabbi or your priest or your friend or your favorite movie star. We need more signers for this endorsement letter. And also it'll give you a chance to contribute if you want, because not everybody can afford to do this on their own nickel.
And who here commits, leaving here, that they will look up the website and sign on?
Thank you.
You've
Thank you,
done your
Heather,
interview.
so much for what you've done
Thank you,
to
Cora.
help this conference produce this.
Thank you, Cora.
Okay.
How about 15 minutes? We were going to ask Judy, and then Leslie, and then our friend from the Women's Funders, and then here. So, so we have about 15 minutes left.
You heard enough about me when Becky talked last night. I'm one of the founding members of the Strike for Peace, but I wonder if you realize that 3 of our women from Westchester County, where I lived, were brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and we all came down to Washington in this very city, 250 of us, and we said we are going to put an end to that committee, and we did. Dagmar Wilson of Washington, the founder of Women's Strike, when they asked her, where are your lists? Lists, she said, we don't keep lists of members. Well, how do you get money? Oh, well, if you're against the war, if you're against the racism, are you, Mr. So-and-so, against all this? Well, it was absolutely incredible. And that was the end of the House Un-American Activities Committee.
When was
But what
that?
I want to tell you that is missing desperately here is another place I visited 7 years ago. I went to Afghanistan before Karzai was elected. Well, that is a place women had to go. We had a meeting. 500 women came from different parts of Afghanistan and went into a movie, a dark and damp, wet movie. They came in burqas, they came in chadors, and they walked into that theater and they threw everything out. Only women. There were hundreds of them. And I was asked to make, I was only one of 2 Americans, Bob Beck and myself had been invited out there. And they asked me to write something because I work at the United Nations. So I wrote a long piece and gave it to my friend, an Afghan friend, who was running this meeting. And she said, it's a very nice speech, Judy, I think you should give it. There's something wrong. You don't tell them how old you are. I said, I won't tell them how old I am. I was kind of young. I was like 84 5. She said, yes, you will. I got up and looked at this crowd of women, and I said, I was Judy Lerner, and I was here from the USA, and I am 85 years old. The place erupted. They screamed. Nobody in that room lived beyond 50 or 60. And it was one of the most encouraging things I have ever seen. We have forgotten about the women in Afghanistan, and that will be my next project.
Leslie Kagan, you probably, many of you have probably been in demonstrations that she has organized, or heard the mobilizations, or she is a heroine, a leader. Even when we were on the committee talking about the preparation for this conference, there were many moments we'd turn to each other and say, well, how will we deal with that? He said, I don't know, but if Leslie's there, she'll figure it out. So, but we appreciate you being here, Leslie.
Thank you. First, a few quick things. First thing is that some of us in those early days of the Antiwar movement, actually at Staughton of women say yes to men who say no, it didn't quite resonate for all of us.
There were many for whom it didn't resonate.
And some of us didn't even know until later how much it didn't resonate. I was active at NYU in the mid-60s, graduated in '68, and actually became the chairman. I wasn't even aware that that was a problem. Chairman of the NYU Committee to End the War in Vietnam, and at one point in the discussion about the draft, some man got up and said that the women should not say anything, right? And only the men should talk about this issue. So we got up, the women got up and left the room. Sort of what you were saying, similar to what you were saying, left the room and had a women's meeting. And we didn't even know that that's what we were doing. In fact, around the same time, a good friend of mine had started to go to some real women's meetings and said, why don't you come? And I said, oh, I don't need that. I'm a strong woman, I don't need that. And then I finally went, and it too changed my life. As much as the anti-war movement changed my life, the women's movement just added another layer to it. There's a lot of history between then and now. I'm not going to go into all of it, it's too much. What I do want to say, though, is that for all of the incredibly central contributions that women have made and continue to make, not only to the war work and the peace work, but to every social change movement, I am still perplexed by how hard it seems to be for men and for some women to get it about feminism and about gender and about patriarchy. I don't understand if it's our fault for not being clear enough. I don't think that's the problem. But there seems to be a resistance. That's the only way I can understand it this way, to letting those insights, that analysis, that understanding into whatever else people are working on. I think we've made some progress in terms of white activists getting it about racism, right? I think we've made some progress around middle-class people getting it about the economic structure, right? But I am stymied by how little progress we've made about the other parts of our movement getting it about feminism. And I don't know what to do about that. Maybe we need another whole conference just to talk about that. But how to actually make the gender analysis part of the overall analysis of what it is that we're up against, what it is we're trying to change. Because until we get that, I don't think we're going to be complete enough. We're not going to be whole enough to actually take on those institutions and structures that cause all these problems. So I think it's got to be that multi-layered class, race, gender analysis that moves us forward. And if we're missing one of our three lines, how are we going to move forward?
Hi, as Cora said, I'm Meredith Schroeder, and I haven't been waiting 50 years to talk, so I won't take too much time. But I wanted to first say thank you, and I'm here to learn. And part of what I do now is to talk about women's role in the peace process and get Cora to talk about it as often as possible. Cora is a founding member of my organization, I should say, the Peace and Security Funders Group. But what I wanted to say was I ran a shelter for sex trafficking survivors for 2 years in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And most people consider the real rise of sex trafficking in Cambodia to be the UN peace presence that was there in the 90s. And so to say that these two things aren't so deeply related is to miss the point entirely. And I also wanted to say that, I don't know if anybody else feels this way, but you know, the Pulitzer for journalism went to that small paper in South Carolina for exposing how South Carolina is the most dangerous state for women in the United States. And so watching these protests in Baltimore, thinking about why aren't we protesting that there is a state that is the most dangerous state for women to live in? Why aren't these things more connected now for my generation? And so I'm here to learn. And I just wanted to say thank you for everybody in this room for all that you've done.
Thank you. One fact I wanted to mention that sort of was like this, why is there not the response? Almost everyone heard about the day when Indiana passed the anti-gay, let corporations decide, businesses decide about
riffraff.
Yes.
I live in Indiana, so.
So almost who here heard about that? Almost everyone's heard about that. The same day, there was a woman who was sentenced to 20 years in Indiana because she had a miscarriage that they said might have been caused as an abortion. I only learned about it, the question on it was beyond gay marriage, but it was about discrimination by corporations against people they wish to discriminate against. I learned about that instantaneously. It was 5 days or so before I even heard about this woman, Rupa, I think, being sentenced. Who heard about that? Now more have.
It happened in South Bend, so it was my home.
But it's just another example about how there's still a lot of work to be done. Back to also what Leslie was saying. And
yeah, very short, but I just was thinking forward, perhaps, or about the values that animated militarism and the values that animated second-wave feminism. What was the tension there, and how did they intersect with each other? And I'm wondering if the same values are present in modern-day feminism. And too often I see, let's say in pop culture and all around, women's empowerment being presented as the embrace of violence in many ways. And this is very troubling to me. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that. Isn't it great we can chop off people's heads just the way men do? I mean, there is something terribly wrong about that. I think that's something we need to think about.
Thank you for elevating that. Thank you.
I just have a burning thing. I want to know how many people in this room have watched One Woman, One Vote and Iron John Angels.
Iron John Angels, yes.
PBS has them. It is, we need to go back to our history for a moment, because I'm concerned, being a Rotary in Seattle, that the young people don't even know about it. It was decades that it took us to get the vote. And if we don't look at these women that stood and went to jail and were tortured for generations because they stood in front of the White House, way out in the curb where they got mud and run over by police and horses. One woman, one vote. blacks had men had votes before women. They took it away, but that's a fact. And so I really, in my community, even though it's not allowed in Rotary, I see that every young person I know gets a copy of One Woman, One Vote or Iron Jawed Women.
Wonderful.
Thank
Well,
you.
And on that, I
And
just
thank you
came
for
back
these
from the
honored
100th
women.
anniversary of Wealth.
Yeah.
And I never understood that it stood on the shoulders and came exactly out of that movement.
And Jody speaks also with Code Pink.
Yes.
So I'm proud to have my pink beret and gloves and scarf. We'll join in on Mother's Day. We have 4 minutes left for the session. I promised one person who's in the hospital that I would read a short thing she provided. Her name is Alice Cohan. She's one of the greatest organizers in the country, and certainly within the women's movement. She's the deputy at Fund for Feminist Majority. Because it's long, I'll summarize it. But she tells the story when she was a college student in DC. I'm looking at this a year. Anyway, it led up to she was training with a team of nonviolent organizers to do liaison negotiations with the police and military during civil disobedience of that week in the May Day demonstrations. She doesn't have the year. Do you remember when they... Well, it's sort of a rising point of the anti-war movement. That Sunday, she was swept up in a women's march where participants, some were chanting for peace, and some were chanting, "Women of the world are picking up the guns." She negotiated the relationships, because that was what she was designed to do, was trained to do. She was kicked, she was dragged, she was beaten, was taken up by the police, by the police who did this, was arrested, and was in cells with people talking on the one hand for revolution and on the one hand for those arguing for Gandhi and King. She wrote this at length because it transformed her and made her decide to bring her values of women in the peace movement with her for whatever she does. She's now been dedicated to the women's movement and nonviolence for 40 years as an organizer in Feminist Majority. And she goes on just even a bit more. She was just given a heart transplant. And she sent this to me. She had wanted to be here, and I told her that I would read this and remember her. In fact, if people would like to write a note to Alice Cohan, and here's a picture of her before the heart transplant, and here's her just after the heart transplant. So she's recovering well, but if you'd like to write something for her at the end, I'd ask you to do that. I know you have the song you wanted to share.
It's very short. But Bethany is here, and maybe they can also sing.
Okay, why don't we, and I was going to end with a poem from the Vietnamese that became an anthem in a way, a part of the women's movement, the Chicago Women's Liberation Movement. But, by the way, Bethany and Rufus, for those who were here last night, we heard their extraordinary...
So this was at the ending of the war, and the women of Vietnam inspired it from the U.S. women's movement to them. Sisters, you keep me fighting, you keep me strong. The struggle we are waging is gonna take our whole lives long. But as I look around and see your faces, feel the fire behind those eyes, I know it's a battle we will stand and win, for freedom voices never die. Many miles away from us, sisters speak a different tongue, but words passed behind those prison walls, in our hearts we're always one. Heroic daughters, spring of Vietnam, your will has persevered. Your tears have washed on the enemy's soil to reverse the tide of years. Sisters, you keep me fighting, you keep me strong.
The struggle we are waging is gonna take our whole lives long. But as I look around and see your faces, feel the fire behind those eyes, I know it's a battle we will stand and win. For freedom voices never die.
Guitar, and maybe we can all join in a song.
We can. There's 1 hour for lunch, which is from 12:15. There's actually 58 minutes now for lunch. There's from 12:15 to 1:15. At 1:30, the mini plenaries begin. And you won't want to miss those either. But those who would like to sit and sing, why don't we do that too? And if anyone would like to write a note to Alice Coates, I encourage you to do it here.